Is this the conversation sort of surrounding Wicked as a movie? Particularly the fact that it does in fact feature a witch. As the entire point of the movie is telling the Wicked Witch from the 39 Wizard of Oz movie.
Yeah.
Like her origin story, revisionist origin story. She's a witch, and as witches tend to do, they're
witchy.
They do witch things, including some magic, and which in this movie, there's like maybe 2 or 3 scenes where she does some sort of magic. One of them, I think the one that most people have pointed out, is like she reads like a spell book, and it's sort of somewhat creepy, and like the monkeys get their wings and stuff, and it's sort of what happens with that. So she's doing, so there is some sort of, some witchcraft. And like, as someone that has reviewed a lot of movies, like I think, I'm over 100 in the last couple of years, I don't think there's any kind of single content thing that gets as sort of provokes as like passionate response from Christians and like negative response as magic. Like I think even like sexual stuff or like, graphic violence or like just blatant immorality, like Christians might not like that, but like you get someone shooting a fireball out of their fingers or like, reading a spell book or like
stirring a cauldron.
Like people get upset. And like that has been the case for this movie. Just, my reviews got some comments for that. Like I think this online, beyond us, just seen a lot of kind of conversations about this, and just a lot of Christians like upset, either like just cautious about it, to the other end of the spectrum of like full on panicked, like outraged, like this is Satan's attack on America, kind of like you get all ranges. So I thought we'd get into that a little bit. Like what do we do with something like this? Because I feel like it touches on kind of two things that I see a lot as someone that does cultural stuff and reviews. And one is like just the way movies work, like, and the way movies, like, agendas and promoting this or promoting that and like, subliminal messaging and all that kind of stuff. Like, I think there is just a sense that I don't know if as Christians, if we're as like well versed or like thoughtful about like this understanding, like how do like stories impact us? How do they not impact us? Like, is it a little deeper? And then kind of the second part of that is just like the witchcraft thing itself. Like is a movie with a witch character, even if it's like a fantasy based on like an old movie that most of us didn't have a problem with, like, is that, like this unbiblical experience, equivalent to the Bible, in like the Old Testament telling us to like not let a witch live and stone them to death. Like, is that like something that Christians should be really concerned about, or is it much to do about very little? But maybe just start on like the first part about that. Like, just like, is a movie like Wicked, like, is that promoting witchcraft? Like, because there is a witch character, like, is that like, because the responses I've seen a lot of is, in a simplistic way of just like Wicked has a witch character, therefore it promotes witchcraft. Because if it's on the screen, then that is the filmmaker's way of saying like, this is, I'm pushing this agenda or this message. Like, I want people to be witches because there's a witch character. Like, is everything depicted like in a part of an agenda or promotion? Like, what are some of your, like, is that how you view movies? Like,
no. I think the movies, when they are portraying something, it's part of telling a story. And so I think when, if there's a witch part of the story, if there, is a bad guy, a villain, it's like, is that promoting villainy? Like, do we have more villains in the world now because people watch whatever the latest Marvel movie and there was a villain, and so, we've got to be careful. Like, we might be just, turning up more villains in the world because there's villains in movies. And so I think it's just a kind of maybe a backwards way to look at sort of what movies are doing. Like, simply because there's an element in the movie doesn't necessarily mean that that's like the thing that the movie wants you to take away. It's like, be more witchy. Like, like that just seems kind of ridiculous, because it's like, you apply that to any other like character or type of character in any movie, and it's like it immediately falls apart, because it's like that just doesn't make sense for that to be the case. And so because
I feel like there's like, in some ways this Wicked thing reflects like the the old battles of like the Harry Potter, burning Harry Potter books, or like
Yeah.
this is idea that like, well, because the character does magic, therefore the author is promoting magic, therefore she herself is a witch. Like, even though she's,
But does she float?
yeah, we can only one way to find out for sure, and we haven't yet done that test. Like, even though she, comes from a Catholic background, and I think is more like nominally Catholic or else like atheist, like she's not a practicing witch,
Right.
But like, I think because we get locked in that mindset of like, well, but like, if she's talking about magic, then she's promoting magic, and you don't promote magic unless you believe in magic, and it becomes this a very simplistic. I think some of it is like the unintended consequences of a good thing. Like, I feel like as like the church has tried to be more engaged with like stories and stuff, like there's been way more emphasis on like, like don't just watch a movie, and turn your brain off, like turn it on and like, spot the worldview implications. And like, I mean, like that's what we do with the collision. Like I think that is a good thing. I just think that the way we've done that sort of has, in some ways, can miss the point of like, because it's all about worldviews and stuff, then we assume like everything in the movie has to be reflective of the worldview. Like the author of a book can't, none of the characters can have a different worldview than the author, because it's a direct, this is like, like the Hemingway thing of just like bleed onto the typewriter. Like,
Yeah.
there's no nuance to that. And like you said, I think like we don't do this with a lot of other areas. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like witchcraft is, like the violent, like the villain stuff. Guys, I was just thinking like, John Wick, is that movie a reflection of the filmmaker, is promoting us going around killing people and like having us being an assassin, or like is it just a movie? Or like the creators, like the Marvel movie, like Thor, like would we assume that like they deep down believe in like the Norse mythology and like the pagan, like, or do they just see that as a story and like they're using that as characters, like or like, talking animals in Zootopia, like. No, like no one believes in talking animals. Like it's a story. It's fictional. They're trying to explore deeper themes, and they're just using sort of those fictional stuff, which like to me that's where Wicked comes in. Like, like I think if you like if you look at sort of like what the original was based on a book, like what the author was trying to explore, it was like way more philosophical. Like the author wasn't a witch, or a wizard or whatever you call a male that does magic. Like. He wanted to explore morality. He's like, hey, what if like our assumptions about good and evil like aren't as simplistic as we think? Like, what if we took like a character who has wicked in her name, like one of the most iconic villains, and what if I like told her story in a way that actually like gave a different context, and like, well, she was more the concept, the result. Like she was influenced by her surroundings and circumstances, and she was made to be evil even if she wasn't. And like which Christians can engage with that, because there's some I do in my review, like there's some questions about that, like are we born evil or wicked, or like is wickedness thrust upon us? Like that's some interesting stuff. And to do so, they're using a witch. Like I think which is why some of this gets me, I don't know, grinds me a bit, because I feel like. When we're too quick to just focus on the surface level of like, well, it's a witch, therefore this movie is about witchcraft, and this is like, then we miss like the deeper, like the more interesting stuff that the movie is actually accomplishing, because no one's trying to promote witchcraft through this movie. Like, I think they are trying to promote some other like ideologies that Christians should be concerned about or like engaged with, but I feel like we miss those conversations if we're just focused on like the knee jerk of like, well, this must be promoting witchcraft because like the main character's a witch.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a particular obsession, I think, of Christians with movie content that deals in witchcraft, and I wonder if it's just because like there is such a thing as like actual witchcraft and like witches and like sorcery and that kind of stuff, and I wonder if for whatever reason that's particularly difficult to just let go of and enjoy or engage with a film, because I don't think people are getting as upset about like Star Wars movies for using the Force. Like I'm sure there are some who do, but you don't see the sort of outcry with Star Wars as we did with like Harry Potter or with Wicked. And I just wonder if it's because there is such a thing as like witchcraft that like it's just harder for people to like disassociate, like to see those as two different things, and like to be able to see a movie as a story, and which is not the same as like practicing witches in reality. Like that should be, I think, something that we can all like separate in our minds. But I just wonder if, because that's such an easy sort of one-to-one comparison for a lot of people, that's just, for whatever reason, fear mongering or what have you, like that's just an easy sort of thing to latch onto.
Yeah, or even like genuine. Like I think you're right. Like I think they're like Christian, like witchcraft and like, dark spirituality and like, demons and say like, that's all real. And like the Bible speaks about that.
Right.
And like Christians should not take that lightly. Like, again, I think because of that, like, it makes sense. The Bible doesn't necessarily speak about, a bunch about guarding yourself against talking animals, like, because that's not a thing that people need to deal with in the real world. Or, like,
right.
It does speak about like maybe pagan mythology and, but we don't necessarily get mad about Thor or stuff. But like, because it does hit closer to home and there is scriptural support for some of that. Like, I feel like it makes sense to me. I think the issue for me is just like, I feel like we need to do a better job as like Christians at like understanding like the difference between like, okay, you have real world witchcraft, dark spirituality, whatever, and then you have like Elsa and Frozen, making the snowman or something. Like, are those the same things? Like, is that like,
right.
can we still distinguish between like fiction and reality and like fantasy and like, in a way, because like, even some of the comments that like I've got for this, like for doing the Wicked review, is like, like people questioning whether I'm even a Christian because I went and saw this movie and I didn't just like yell in my own review the whole time about how it's satanic. Like the implication is that like I was actively participating in witchcraft because the character on screen who's like who's green is like doing some trying to levitate a coin in the air, and like therefore like I'm compromising my faith if I ever had.
Well, the fact that you didn't disassociate from the movie is evidence that you've been bewitched.
Yeah, there's some of that too of just like we're powerless against.
You've been drawn into the greenness.
And I do think there is some carryover to just like sort of the satanic panic of like the 1980s of just like I feel like witchcraft and stuff is a serious thing Christians should be concerned about. But like, when's the last time in like Ingles grocery store you just like came across a witch? Like, I feel like the disproportionate like way that it's treated is like that's the number. Like, what we need to really be afraid of is like kids turning into witches because they're watching Frozen. Yeah. Where it's like, well, people dabble in witchcraft. Like, there is some of that. Like, even not far from where we live is a big capital for that. Like, but like, if you were to put like the 10 most pressing cultural things for Christians, like for me, like, witchcraft doesn't make the list. Like, there's a lot of other, sexual immorality or, worldview stuff. Or, like, there's a bunch of other things way more concerning to Christians than like a bunch of kids becoming witches because they saw, a green character give monkeys wings.
Well, and again, I think it kind of goes back to the ease of being able to just sort of identify and target that versus like, well, so what are the underlying worldviews of this? So like going to that second level of like, what's the conversation this movie's trying to have? And I think, some people will just see sort of the headline of it, oh, it's got witchcraft, and so clearly we're just going to end the conversation. Whereas I think if we take the time with whether it's witchcraft or just any other themes in a movie or work of art, like take time to understand what is it that's actually trying to be said here, and is there something that we can engage in with that? Because I think so many times we miss the really rich conversations that could be had because we sort of have shut it down because, it's on the surface of it, it seems like something that we should be against, I guess. And so I think that's a tragedy for the church to just so quickly stop those conversations.
Well, it's like I don't know if you remember our old podcast we used to do, like the Sam Smith, was it the Grammy Oscar, where like he like dressed up as like a devil and like, did some like ritual thing and sang this, very like, profane song. And like a lot of Christians freaked out about it. He dressed up as a devil. It's witchcraft, it's satanic. And I feel like he's not a practicing Satanist, but like he's using the imagery, but like there are a lot deeper issues and stuff that Christians should focus on that they miss because it's like, well, it's Satan. Like, that's what we need to, he's turning our kids into Satanists or whatever. And one of the things too, which is funny too, because I was talking to my kids. I have 2 9-year-old boys. Like yesterday, I was talking to them about the podcast and stuff, and like that we were talking about this. I forget how it came up, and I kind of told them like, some Christians actually have an issue with because of this. And like it's funny, like one of my 9-year-olds sort of looked at me like, almost bewildered and was like, but like, it's not real. Like just the ability of like a 9-year-old to like distinguish, like, but like, obviously that's fictional magic. Like it's not like he assumes that would be real.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes kids have an easier time doing that than
Which I think is funny because I did see an old clip of the original Wizard of Oz. The actress went on Mr. Rogers and was like, Mr. Rogers was kind of interviewing her and explaining to the children audience, like, she's not actually a witch. Like, and like she like dons the hat and like talks in her witchy voice, and they have a good laugh, and it's like, yeah, okay. Like even back then, like I just thought it was funny that like the original Wicked Witch of the West was like going on to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and just explaining like, I was acting like it's
Mr. Rogers was promoting witchcraft.
Yeah, that's your takeaway. Yeah, but it's just like, and I think to your point, like kids, I think often are quick to realize like, yeah, we know that's fiction. Like,
yeah, and I feel like that is which I hopefully is clear in this episode, is like the issue is not that Christians should take lightly witchcraft. Respect.
Right.
The issue for me is more just like, I don't think fictional fantasy musical stuff that doesn't reflect real world, occult stuff in any way. Like, I don't think that is witchcraft. Like, I think that is fantasy magic. Because like the verses whenever I do a review for something that has magic, the same verses sort of get kind of thrown at me in the comments, where we have like, Leviticus 19:31 says, do not turn to mediums or necromancers, do not seek them out, and so make yourself unclean by them. Or, Deuteronomy 18 condemns people who practice divination and sorcery and calls them an abomination to the Lord. Exodus 22:18 is like the most heavy metal of these verses, where it says, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." So that's pretty unmistakable. There are a few. I mean, most of the verses that get brought up are Old Testament verses. There are a couple like New Testament stuff, like Galatians 5 includes like sorcery as, I guess, a sinful work of the flesh. So like there is no denying, like the Bible is not like, doesn't beat around the bush about like sorcery is bad like that.
Yeah.
There's no ambiguity of like, well, maybe it's kind of okay. Like it's bad. Like, and Christians need to stay away from it, not practice it. It's just that I think what gets missed in some of that verses is like like when the first century Bible writers are like condemning sorcery, like they're not talking about green people on a movie screen. Like they're talking about like pagan cults that many of like the believers have come out of, like in the first century.
Yeah.
And like sacrificing children and like worshiping through like sexual immorality and like all this stuff, like very clearly like it was a reality for them. Like it wasn't like some entertainment in a story. Like you even have Paul, he's quoting from Greek poems and stuff. Like he had no problem with that. It's like, but don't practice this because this is a reality of our culture. And you can't do both. Like you can't.
Yeah.
And the thing that stands out to me, like with those verses too, because it's like, I mean, those get thrown out as like very authoritative. Like these verses directly apply to watching like fantasy movies. Like when it says, do not permit a sorceress to live. If you're going to watch a movie about a sorcerer, like, you're obviously going against, what Moses wrote in Exodus. It's just the thing is like that we don't like, we're not consistent with that. Like, I think like what I was thinking about with this, like with these verses is like, if the implication is like the director of Wicked is promoting witchcraft, therefore he himself is like a witch. Like if the people that are really mad about this and like look into these verses as like the reason why we can't even engage with that, like if we came across him on the street walking his dog, like would we kill him? Like if the Bible is saying do not permit, sorcerer to live, like do we really think that there's a direct one-to-one? Like either we don't really think these verses apply in the same way as they, to this context as they did to the first century, or else we don't really believe that he is in fact a witch promoting witchcraft.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, it's probably a combination of both. But I just feel like we don't, I don't know how much we really believe that like these people are witches, or if there's this sort of the knee-jerk fear, and then we get caught up in the outrage, and like, we're sort of fearful that, America's falling apart and there's all these ideologies, and so we push back against it because we're not going around killing witches and stuff, or we're not going to go stone J.K. Rowling because she wrote about wizards. Like clearly, even the people that are upset can see that there's a difference between like the fantasy and like the real world context of what Paul was talking about or Peter was talking about.
Yeah, and I just wonder, is part of this just sort of a product of just the ease with which we can sort of foment outrage nowadays. And so it's like, it's kind of an easy thing to just pile on and, kind of throw around these verses and say, oh, it's evil witchcraft, and, you get some likes, and you get, does it all come back to just sort of feeding the self-absorbed machine that is social media, and, getting engagement because you're being, sensational in your takes on, whatever's happening in culture? Or, I don't know. I think it's partly that, and again, like we've said, I think it's partly just sort of the conflation of what's in a story and what's in fiction versus like what's actually happening. So I don't know. I think there are some genuine people that are just misguided, and I just think there's also people who are just looking to sort of capitalize on the fear and like, hey, this is a hot take, and I'm just going to run with it because I can.
Yeah, and I think fear, and this is, then we can move on to the next story, but I feel like fear for me is the big word. Like, I think there's people capitalizing on fear that people have, but then I think there's also just a lot of Christians that, whether it's this or with other kind of concerns, that are just, you can just tell like they're very driven by fear. Like, because even with like with Wicked, like some of the conversations I've seen is like, well, like I know it is fiction, like, even if they do sort of draw that line, but it sort of like normalizes, like it could maybe lead you down the path to the occult, and like it's just not worth it as a Christian. Like, we need to play it safe. Like, it's, and there's some different analogies that they give for that, and sort of like, the classic like slippery slope thing. Like, it's sort of a gateway. It is fiction, and maybe it's harmless, but like you never know. And like if there's any chance that that's going to pull you into the occult, like you need to stay away. And I don't know. Like, I think there's definitely in Scripture very clearly a place for like prudence and wisdom and discernment, and like we shouldn't, like there's a time like, Joseph in Egypt fleeing the house, leaving his coat behind. There's definitely a place to be very cautious and like guard ourselves and our purity. But I also, I don't know, like as Christians, I feel like if anyone should not be driven by just fear, like this constant fear that like my faith's going to get pulled away, or, that like I'm powerless against another worldview that doesn't support mine. Like I don't know. Like to me, there's just an issue with some of that. And like, I have no problem with people that just are uncomfortable with it and be like, hey, you know what? I was uncomfortable by the witchcraft stuff, so I'm not going to watch it. Like, I think the part that gets me more feisty is just when you go from there and you sort of, you begin to adopt more of like a Pharisee attitude of like, and because I'm uncomfortable with it, therefore, if you disagree with me, there's a good chance you're not even a Christian.
Yeah.
Like I feel like Jesus, like to me, that's more of a concerning thing than anything. I'm like Wicked, whether even if it was promoting it, which I don't think it is, like I feel like seeing that one movie with that, and as a Christian, I can kind of navigate that. Like to me, that's less of an issue than like a lot of Christians going around like trying to imply that like salvation in Jesus, you got to believe and profess, he is Lord, and also not see the movies that I don't like. Like, to me, that is a bigger issue for Christians than the fact that there's some witches and stuff and fantasy.